Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 2 of the Simulation Pending podcast. Today we'll be talking about World of Warcraft's lore, going through what the current narrative is, what we think Warcraft should have been, where we think the story probably could have gone, and lastly, actually speculating where we think the story is going to go. As always, I'm joined by my three friends, Charlie, Emmett, and Josh. I don't think we need a introduction this time, so we'll jump right into it. What do you guys actually think of Shadowlands from what we've seen?
From my first playthrough, well, I only played through it once, but I think Shadowlands has the core in terms of game mechanics that is what people want in playing WoW, but I just think it's so far disjointed from what WoW used to be that it just feels weird to play through this very cosmic space island hopper.
I don't necessarily think that going down that cosmic route was necessarily a bad thing, because they were already kind of doing that with the old gods, like considering, you know, they're a pretty external space cosmic being. But I think they just sort of rushed into what they wanted, like what they're doing in Shadowlands with the jailer, who we didn't know anything about, but they said, oh, every major event that you have enjoyed was actually the jailer. Totally him, not anything you've come to know.
That's one of the key points you've raised there, is that Shadowlands is certainly not the first Warcraft story to go cosmic, per se. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's almost less cosmic than, at the very least, Legion, and you could almost argue for anything that's ever taken place in Outland, in some regards. But it is something they've been building up to, and it's a style of cosmic setting that has not been ever tried in Warcraft previously.
I suppose it's a different sort of cosmic in a way, because before it's sort of like, oh, these are, say with the Burning Legion, these are pretty much aliens coming to scour our world. It's almost a space threat, whereas with Shadowlands, when we're talking about cosmic here, it's like, this is the fundamental mechanics of the universe, which is sort of almost a different tier of cosmic, maybe.
Yeah, it's a very different feeling setting, even though it may not be more absurd in terms of power, that sort of thing. It is definitely a setting that has only been explored on occasion in individual instances, raids, dungeons, that sort of thing. Now, you could make an argument that the Emerald Dream is of a similar feeling to the Shadowlands as a whole, but of course they're even saying that the Emerald Dream is in some way derived from the Shadowlands. It's even a tier above that, but I think they've definitely played with this type of setting on occasion, but it's always been just these odd little bits interspersed in, rather than the entire expansion and entire story being completely set and based around this type of setting and place.
I suppose when it comes to the Emerald Dream, the interesting thing is, like, we've known about the Emerald Dream for ages. Like, it's been fundamental to the Druids since, well, Warcraft 3, which you can sort of say, like, that's the baseline of probably what Warcraft is. Like, that's what really sparked everyone's interest in it. But then when Shadowlands came about, they really just went, oh, by the way, it's associated with Ardenweald, and they just sort of shoehorned it in.
I think you could say that about most of the lore pertaining to the Shadowlands. It's certainly not a new concept. The idea of the Shadowlands has been around in Warcraft lore for quite a long time. The difference here is the previous idea, it was a very nebulous, sort of a very conventional idea of an afterlife. It's a place where the spirits of the deceased go. What they've done in Shadowlands is they've given it a very rigid and quite really narrow structure, which doesn't gel particularly well with the previous concepts of the Shadowlands as a place. And then, of course, they've tried to, as you say, shoehorn in these connections to other things to try and make this version of the Shadowlands feel like it has been around longer than it is, in terms of any of the objects that have been, it's a retcon that everything associated with the Lich King comes from the Shadowlands and not from the Legion. Even the aesthetic of the Scourge is, in theory, now has been based on one of the factions in the Shadowlands. It's, as you say, it's quite shoehorned in a lot of what they've done.
Yeah, to me, it feels like the story had like a direction I thought it was going, and then that very quickly was like, no, wait, we're not doing that, we're going to finish that, and then just, we want to go this way. and that way happened to be, let's go to the Shadowlands and deal with this threat we haven't heard of before. When really what I thought was going to happen was completely different.
Well, it's really that they just wanted to run with the Sylvanas storyline. I feel like that's been the big thing, because the change in writers only sort of happened relatively recently. It was, start of BFA? Around that
The
period
start
of
of
time?
Legion.
Yeah.
It was around the start of Legion, and you can tell.
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing for me was, like, I can understand that this story is playing out, and that I think, yeah, it's perfectly fine that the story goes in this direction. I just think that they forsake so much other stuff that has been going on in the WoW story, and they're just like, no, forget about that. We're doing this. Like, I look at it like the final patch of BFA being Ny'alotha. And it's like, why the hell did Ny'alotha not get its own entire expansion?
It ended up feeling a lot like that was just to say,
It was just like, hey, let's just finish this story, and then so now we can move on to something new.
Yeah, it felt like it was tying up loose ends that they didn't really want to deal with, so that they could move on with the story that
Exactly.
they wanted to tell, which is not, wanting to tell a specific story is not inherently a bad thing. The issue we now seem to have, at least from everything I've seen, is with the context we now have in Shadowlands, it is very clear that this is the specific end goal that we have been progressing towards since the start of Legion. The shift in focus and tone really started to land harder in Legion, and now with Shadowlands out, it feels, in retrospect, like Legion and BFA were rushing to wrap up any loose ends that people could think of in order to reach this point that they really wanted to do.
In order to get to this story that they wanted to tell.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, for people who were invested in the WoW story, like all of us, is a really unfortunate way to wrap up stories that have been, like, in the works for a decade.
Yeah, and it was very clear in BFA, and to a lesser extent in Legion at points, it did not feel like the core story of those expansions was the focus. It didn't feel like that was the thing that was getting attention or the thing that was cared about. Instead, it was this story which we now know was leading to the Shadowlands story. It was that build-up of Sylvanas, which occasionally gelled well with those other stories that were being told in Legion and BFA, but it is now clear that that was the end goal. Those expansions, in retrospect, feel like they were built with this end goal in mind, and everything else was secondary. And as someone who is profoundly uninterested in Shadowlands, that means I am now retroactively less interested in those previous expansions.
Well, I think the interesting thing, and it's the key idea that you could sort of actually point to and say, this is actually big proof of that sort of concept of they want to retroactively change a lot of things, is with the Chronicles, not even in World of Warcraft. Because the whole point of the Chronicles originally was, here is going to be the holy Bible of WoW lore, this is what happened. And then to facilitate what, or the post changes they want to make to facilitate the story they want to tell, they added in the new cosmology. They went back and went, oh, actually, there's a race called the First Ones that were above the Titans, and the Chronicles were written by the Titans, and it's going to be biased. So, stuff you if you spent money on it.
It's an interesting sign of your storytelling when something that was advertised as a out-of-world representation of the lore, as in this is the canon lore, as it was presented when it was released, when you're retconning that within a couple of years to be effectively meaningless for someone who bought them for that purpose.
Well, you remember that full, very lovely cosmology chart that was in there with all the different kinds of magic? It was absolutely
the one that introduced the voidlords?
Yep, the one that introduced the voidlords. So even that was like cosmic enough. But when they introduced an entirely new one, and I think there's a quote along the lines of, "Ha, that cosmology from the Chronicle, you thought that was real? You fool! You absolute buffoon! How could you think that was real? Here's the actual one where Azeroth is the center of the universe," which is about as jarring a sort of drift as you can make from what was originally printed.
And it's that same effect of, with the context I now have, I have far less investment and care for those stories that were told previously, because I know where they were going, or I know where they wanted them to go. I know where the stories themselves were going at the time, but they weren't taken there because they were not the story that was wanting to be told.
Yeah, and I think that's like what the saddest part, at least for me, is that all these storylines that we became so invested in over the years, it was almost as if they got to this turning point and went, so all these other storylines we were doing, let's put those all to the side. We'll deal with them, but we'll deal with them in a patch form instead of expansion form like they probably deserve. And then we'll just get to our new story as fast as we can, which I just think takes away from everything that's happening. Because, like, yes, the game itself, the rating is great, the dungeons are great, everything else has arguably gone downhill to a certain extent, but it just hurts everything when the story is just so rushed and so taken in this new direction that no one really understands.
I suppose that almost leads to the question, it's just, why do I care?
Yeah, that's exactly what you get when you have such a quick leveling experience. Right?
Well, it's also
and the story is very short.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you get red patches. Sorry.
The story being short is only accentuated to be worse by the fact that we're not invested in what's going on. Whereas like in Legion would have taken a similar amount of time, 10, 12, maybe a little bit more time to get whatever it was, 100 to 110 or whatever the level cap was back then. But it's at least everything's a little bit more familiar. Everything, the world you're in, the people you're doing quests for, the enemies you're fighting are things you've seen before, things that you know are dangerous. And particularly having the overarching threat of the Legion in general makes everything a lot more dire, makes the world feel like it's in proper danger. Whereas with this, it's like we're sort of just sitting here like watching the story roll past us while it plays out on a stage and we just watch.
So I actually think that's a really interesting point, because personally, what you just described, I think is how storytelling in WoW should be and when it is at its best, when the player character is effectively a bystander. Because I think in terms of storytelling and narrative in a game, I think with MMOs, there are really a couple of ways to do it. And all of the ones you named, Guild Wars, Final Fantasy, Star Wars, the player character is the center of the story. And I think particularly Guild Wars and Final Fantasy. Star Wars is a little more in between, but Guild Wars and Final Fantasy, those worlds only really exist as MMOs. So the stories that are being told can be built around player character being the central protagonist, or at least a central player in events. Because before stepping in your player character, you don't know what this world is. For something like WoW, everyone who picked up WoW, and especially through Burning Crusade and Wrath, the player character was not the most important character in the game. The characters in the setting, for at least anyone who had played Warcraft 3, or anyone who had played any previous Warcraft game, in those we had played as Arthas, as Thrall. So in many ways, our player characters was more like us in being a ringside seat to the story, where we're sort of being carried along with those characters that we care about in this story that we care about. But in a narrative sense, we aren't the main actors. And I think it's interesting in a game like that, I think lends itself, and any MMO can do this, but I think a game where your player character is more sidelined in the in-game narrative leaves a lot more room for player stories to come up. And I think this is something interesting that I've been seeing going back to our first episode on New World. Every story I have seen coming out of that game is about players.
Yeah.
It's about the player groups. It's like you see in Eve. No one talks about the narrative of Eve. It's there. There is some interesting story going on in the world of Eve, but no one is interested in that. They're interested in the player stories. Because we no longer have those characters and story that we cared about. That was why it worked for Classic, why it worked for BC. You know, we cared about Illidan as a character. We cared about Arthas. I am not aware of anyone who cares about the Jailer. There are obviously a lot of people who care about Sylvanas, and that's a very personal decision. I don't care, because I don't see Sylvanas as the same character that she was when I found her interesting. But in terms of the new characters, I'm not really aware of many, if any, people that actually care about their stories in the way that people have of past expansions.
Yeah, and I think it, again, just comes back to that these things just haven't been developed, so we really don't have a reason to feel that with a lot of the characters that are currently in WoW. And I mean, obviously, Shadowlands brought back a lot of other characters that had previously died, but I feel like that was just a shot in the dark to hopefully get people to come back.
Without going too deep on it, because I think it's a topic much broader in narrative, 99 times out of 100, I think bringing characters back from the dead does not work and actively hinders the story, because especially in something like WoW, where it was never planned for those characters to come back, those characters had conclusions to their story. And now those conclusions, again, as Shadowlands has done with a lot of other things, have been rendered either completely meaningless or far less meaningful than they were when they were actual conclusions.
I think the most egregious example of that has to be Uther's story. Whereas at the end of Wrath of the Lich King, and especially if you get the Shadowmourne legendary, you get a thing to give to Uther's spirit, and he goes, cool, I can now be content. I've got what I want from this world. But then in the cinematic about Uther pre-Shadowlands, he goes, but Frostmourne actually splits the soul in two, so he can still have Uther in the Shadowlands, which is one of those, like, it didn't have that satisfying end, which it really should have at the end of Wrath of the Lich King, considering how intertwined we knew those characters both were, and also felt a bit contrived. It was like, oh, yeah, we just want to bring people back.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it also, like, belies the fact that they're not able to create more interesting characters. If you have to bring back Uther, it's like, why can't you just make someone else?
Yeah.
Right? Like, and it's because so many people have been like, there's been so little interweaving of future expansions into X-Packs. Who's there? Right, like, I look at Shadowlands cinematics, I'm like, who is anyone in these, right? Like no one's related to anyone. In Classic, like, your big bads, you knew about through the leveling experience, which was long. BC, obviously Illidan and Kael, and you have Arthas, and you have Deathwing, like dragons, right? Like, it's all reasonable, and it's all been there for a long time. And now we've got, like, owls and blue people in the afterlife. Oh, but there's Uther.
You remember Uther, guys, right?
You remember Uther, right? Like,
he's blue now.
I do, man. Like, and he died. I like that he was dead because it meant something when he died. You feel bad when Arthur's killed him.
Yeah, you like those, when a character dies in a story, they can die in a way that means you're pleased with how the story played out, and they died for a meaning, they died for a cause, they died for an end goal.
Yeah, Uther died a hero.
When they bring people back, and they bring them back for no other real reason other than, hey, people might like this, it just takes away from everything that was.
Because I think the bringing a character back has to be A, very well planned, and B, feel like a journey. So going back to the Warcraft 3 example, to bring Kel'Thuzad back from the dead, Arthur's had to purge the Elf. If you have to kill 90% of an entire race just to get to a font of huge magical energy just to resurrect one dude, that almost feels reasonable. Like, there's a journey up to it. There's a planned trip to bring someone back from the dead.
Yeah,
whereas
narratively, it's an introduction, not a bringing back. Anyway.
Yeah, and Kel'Thuzad was also dead for, half of a campaign? You kill him a bit less than halfway through the human campaign, and he is speaking with Arthas in the first missions of the Undead campaign.
Well, that's where the planning comes in.
Precisely, but it's the thing of, maybe if they had wanted to bring Uther back in some way, within the Shadowmourne questline in that period, when he would have been narratively relevant and interesting, you could I don't know that it would have been the best decision, but it would have been more than, and it's an issue that's been discussed in all sorts of media at the moment with the number of reboots and the popularity of reboots and remakes at the moment, that nostalgia cannot carry a narrative.
And I think the most egregious thing with the whole Uther thing, that just came to mind, is that I think the worst thing for me is that it was Uther because they needed someone for the good guy faction, not because Uther had to come back. We have the good guys. Who's the good guy who's dead? Oh, Uther. It's not like, gee whiz, let's get Uther back because that would be a great thing. And I mean, obviously he's related to Arthas, but it just feels like, come on.
The reason for it to be Uther is because when people saw that trailer, they went, oh, I know Uther, and it gave them that little, their little buzz of endorphins or whatever, and made them like the trailer more than they would have if they had all been completely original characters. I mean, you can, frankly, Uther in that doesn't feel like Uther anyway, but if you made it not Uther, how would that play differently to a WoW audience? It didn't go over terribly well anyway, but if those were all just completely original characters, I made this mistake the first time I watched a bunch of Shadowlands things, I would have thought it was for Diablo.
It did look a lot more generic fantasy than actual Warcraft.
It wasn't WoW. Like, there was nothing in there that looked like WoW. You can vaguely recognize Uther.
I think that's a failing of Shadowlands as a whole, to be honest.
I think the mistake with some of Shadowlands is expecting people to be automatically invested in a lot of these old characters, when really we were invested in them, but that story arc finished, and now we're looking for other things, or other heroes, other adventures to be invested in, not to rehash other old things that we've already sort of concluded.
And it's interesting how it can be simultaneously difficult, but also quite easy to make characters that people can become invested in and can care about. Now, I can think of quite a few original characters from WoW, especially in the early days, that I would say a lot of people, especially in the peak of WoW playership, people would have been invested in these characters. So, just as an example, Hemet Nessingwary. Now, here's the question. Hemet was in from vanilla. When do you think you might have become invested in him as a character that you not only recognised but also cared about in the game?
I think by BC, to be honest. That's when I remember you walk into Nagran from Zangamarsh, and who do you see next to like a blown up gyrocopter, but that absolute maniac asking to genocide like all living creatures in this area. I actually do specifically remember I was leveling with a friend in original BC, and I saw him and I'm like, holy shit, it's that guy from Stranglethorn Vale.
Yeah, so Declan, Charlie, would you say something similar, BC?
Yeah, I think so.
BC or maybe even Wrath with the very similar, the full Nessingwary camp.
Yeah, exactly.
Shalazar.
For me, it was definitely Wrath, but I didn't start playing until BC. So pretty consistently for the four of us, it took the second or even third expansion that a character appears in. And to be fair, I've picked a pretty strong example here that Hammett, I mean, the quests were very generic. Go and kill this thing, go and kill this thing. But it was a long enough quest line and there was enough characterization that he was an interesting character from the first series of quests that he had. But you didn't care about him until there was that nostalgia hit. And this is where the nostalgia can work, you know. It's that guy from Stranglethorn Vale. And then they kept doing that, and it built up. When was the first time we all saw the Jailer? And this is obviously very overly simplifying how characters, associations, and people liking characters works, but we'll do it for a bit of fun. When was the first time we saw the Jailer?
Oh, was he even in any of the Shadowlands introductory
I think it
trailers?
might have been right at the end of the Shadowlands introductory quest.
Yeah, that's the first time I remember seeing him.
There was talk of him, but
there was in fact.
Really, yeah.
So he was never mentioned by name in BFA. I think the name might have come up in some of the pre-launch stuff. Maybe the name, or there were certainly hints of him as a character towards the end of BFA. Would you be surprised that there was actually a teaser that showed him? Not the cinematic trailer, because there was, again, no mention of the Jailer. Sylvanas was very clever in referencing the world as a prison, that she will set us all free, which I believe is still theoretically foreshadowing of her defeating the Jailer, because no, this world's not the prison, the other world's the prison, and now she's going to set us free by defeating the Jailer. It's heavy-handed, we'll see if it actually happens. But the point is, we don't care about the Jailer because we haven't had time to get to know him yet. He's just another generic big bad.
He's only bad because they say he's bad. We haven't had any experience of him actually being bad.
But we have, because he's actually the cause of all of the evil that has ever befallen Azeroth.
Yeah.
That's how they're trying to make us invested in him. But the fact is, except for the characters they're bringing back to life, and except for the characters that have come to Shadowlands with us, every single character in Shadowlands has this problem.
A quick sort of almost aside, coming down to the fact that, you know, the Jailer has apparently been responsible for everything we would care about, effectively.
He's had a hand in everything, let's put it that way.
Yeah, him and his minion. And everyone's basically going, we'll beat the Jailer, we'll send him back to jail or kill him at the end of Shadowlands. They've fundamentally changed everything that everyone cares about for an expansion that had virtually, you know, a couple of hints in BFA. That's hell of a commitment for a story. I struggle to think of where they're going with the narrative if this isn't the end of it and they're just like, all right, we want to wipe the slate clean and go and do our own story with more original characters.
That is the only way they can go at this stage, unless they're going to go back to, well, we've defeated literally every threat in existence, so now we're just going to fight Horde versus Alliance again.
Which, let's be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if the next one's Horde versus Alliance again.
Yeah, the Horde War Chief will get angry again, whoever it is.
The Horde War Council, forget they're a democracy now. Surprised to see them and I actually don't think that faction conflict is the most likely direction for them to go. I wouldn't be surprised to see them pull the switcheroo and make the Alliance the, you know, quote-unquote antagonists. Make them look like the bad guys. Because really, other than Southang and what they tried to do with the Horde later in BFA, the Horde have been portrayed as the bad guys for several expansions now, really.
Yeah. And the Alliance
In
is
comparison
like
to the Alliance.
lawful good, the nicest guys you ever met.
That's right. I wouldn't be surprised to see them finally, it takes a while for things to flow down the line from people complaining about stuff to actually having it implemented in the narrative. I wouldn't be surprised to see them finally, having had the years now for feedback to flow into the story, to see them actually listen to and completely misunderstand the feedback about the Horde being portrayed as bad guys, and just make the Alliance the bad guys instead, and just, have Gen take over for Anduin and basically declare war on the Horde because, 2 war chiefs in a row have basically screwed over the world. The Horde can't be trusted, we need to overthrow them. Anduin, assuming he's still alive after Shadowlands, can't stop Gen. As we had in BFA, you have the faction divided, the Alliance is effectively the bad guys, and Gen is leading this splinter group. Tyrande, if Tyrande's alive, she'll obviously go along with him, and they will get involved in something, or just generally be terrible.
Which I almost want to give the Night Elves, considering they've done nothing with their story after they committed genocide. I feel like a big problem with WoW lore in general is that they don't really... Nothing almost feels significant in the modern narrative. Like, that hasn't been touched on at all, except for one of the most recent cinematics where a loon rocks up and goes, "Oh, I didn't save any of the people in the burning genocide tree. I just thought that, go to Ardenweald. Oh, whoops, I set them to hell. Rip." But on
What kind of god does that? Like, what's the deal with it? What's the deal with Elune? Right, like, considering that's the first time Elune has, presented herself, that was terrible. That was absurd.
That's because Elune should never be presented as a character.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, that's exactly it.
Yeah, there was no situation in which Elune shows themselves as a character that goes well. Like, Elune is a force of nature more than they are a manifest deity.
And, I mean, then what does it matter if you die? Why would Elune care about anyone? Oh, well, I'll just allow everyone to burn to death. All these, literally thousands of men, women, and children. Because don't worry, they'll just go to the afterlife. That's just bizarre.
What has anything been
what does anything matter?
Until that point? Yeah, exactly.
Why would we ever assume that Elune would save everyone? Night Elves have died repeatedly in the past. The point isn't that Elune stops them dying, it's that Elune protects them. That was kind of the entire point of the whole cutscene of Ysera dying. We won't get into the waste of that was Ysera coming back, but Elune didn't save Ysera in the sense of preventing her death, but she did protect and save her in the way that kind of deity does. And it is left, and this is a fundamental flaw with Shadowlands, in my opinion. This is a very subjective issue, but the nature of life after death, even in a world, even for someone who is protected by Elune, was left very open and nebulous, which I think is a good thing, personally, in narrative. I do like a bit of mystery and unknown.
100%, right? It'll never be as interesting. It will very rarely be as good as what you could speculate it to be.
But it also, the whole Elune thing touches on another thing that I think is just a problem with the current storytelling, is that, they build these characters up, and then when they hit their peak, or not necessarily their peak, they hit their, point where things are starting to become really dire and really important, and then they just put it on pause and they go do something else for a little while, and then they'll bring it back later, and it's well, we were invested in what was going on with Elune, but we've just spent all this time doing something else, and now you're trying to tell us that Elune's really important.
Which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing if they're actually actively running an A and a B plot,
exactly,
simultaneously.
Exactly.
I mean, I think Elune as well suffers more than just that, because we've spent literally since Warcraft 3 hearing about Elune as this deity, and now we're in the afterlife. This is the thing, Shadowlands is literally the afterlife of the Warcraft universe. This is not just the Emerald Dream. This is the afterlife for the entire universe of Warcraft, as far as we know, because we have other races here that we have never encountered before. So, in that context, Elune really stops mattering as much.
Yeah, exactly.
Or at least becomes less... Elune is on par with what we are doing now, rather than being far above and this mysterious, all-powerful force. Elune is now just another thing in the Shadowlands.
Well, I think they did that with pretty much every character. Even the Titans, they sort of brought back down to that sort of level of it's almost known. And in a way, I think they understood that, and that's why they brought the concept of the first one, which are just Titans, which seems like another one of those narrative, like, oh, we have to throw in something for this to make sense or to add a bit of mystery in it. So we haven't explained literally everything in Shadowlands, because I think, Emmett, you made the point that mystery is fun. Speculation is fun. Like, you can go onto YouTube and the amount of speculation videos that exist are dime a dozen.
Yeah, and I don't think we should get too much into the idea of power creep in Warcraft storytelling, because I think that is a whole other topic that I would like to get into in a future episode. But it is a fundamental problem that Shadowlands is the biggest example of yet. And if they continue the power creep, for lack of a better term, that's happening in the storytelling, the first ones will cease to be a threat within a couple of expansions. And they will, if they want to keep some sort of mystery, they will have to add something beyond those, and continue, because of they have now established this pattern of power creep. They either need to stop that, which will make our characters suddenly feel vastly weaker than they previously were, or make progress feel far less meaningful, or they will have to, until the end of WoW, constantly add new, unknown, bigger threats, because at this point, prior to anything we know about in Shadowlands, there is almost nothing in WoW lore that makes a credible threat for the player characters.
I almost wouldn't mind if they pulled a Final Fantasy, a Realm Reborn, and kind of reset things a bit. Like, you know, we get to patch 9.2, the Jailer's about to put the MacGuffin stones in the MacGuffin machine and reset the universe, because I think that's what's going on. But then, you know, we stop him from remaking the universe in his image, but the universe originates anyway, or it changes something in the fundamental fabric of reality, and it comes back almost a couple of steps on that power creep level. So I feel like at a certain point, you're never going to get any interest if you have to keep on adding those bigger threats, which I think you're 100% right, Josh, that's where they're headed.
Yeah, they've sort of backed themselves into a corner of just having to one-up themselves every expansion. And I think they were always going to get to that point, but it just didn't have to happen so quick. There were so many other core storylines to Warcraft that could have been played out that were still very dire, still very important stories, but they chose to either forego them or skip over them or very, very briefly touch on them.
I actually don't think within reason they ever had to reach that point. I think that was a fundamental shift in the storytelling and game design that happened further into WoW.
Yeah.
So certainly in the context of Shadowlands, it is one of the most, to me at least in the narrative, one of the most fundamental problems with Shadowlands is that it is the culmination of that power creep.
I suppose that leads us on to the question of where do we actually think the lore is going to go after Shadowlands, considering they've really taken it up to the notch of, I want to press the reset button on the universe. Where do you think we actually head afterward?
I think the problem is that I had a clue. I think the problem is that we all thought we knew where it was going when we thought this point that we're potentially at now, where they're pressing the reset button, was coming at the end of Legion when we were off on a different planet for ages. And then it made sense that we were going to come back and the world would have been reset, and it was going to be Old God corrupted, and N'Zoth would be fucking shit up, and Ny'alotha would have risen from the fucking depths, or something crazy like that, bringing back a core piece of the story of Warcraft that has now taken over because we weren't there to stop it. But instead, we came back from Legion, and then we decided to fight each other again. And then in the process of fighting each other again for one patch, the old gods came back for one patch, and then Sylvanas fucked shit up. I think we're so far gone from where we can speculate where the fuck we're supposed to be going, other than a proper reset.
I'll say this. I don't think they'll do a proper reset. I could believe that they might. I will be astonished if they actually take that step.
I'd probably be inclined to agree with you as well. I think they're too far gone to ever think of something like that. I think if they were ever going to do that, it would have happened already.
Honestly, I reckon the main reason that they're not going to do it is more they don't want to spend the money making what is effectively a WoW 2 or doing another Cataclysm in the current state of WoW when it's all the numbers are going down.
The only reasonable way I think they could pull that off effectively is if it is the end of WoW. That point is where the narrative of WoW ends. And I do not believe Blizzard is at that I don't think they're that desperate yet. I think
No.
they're still going to try and wring as much money out of this as they can.
Oh, I completely agree.
Mm.
And I think the only way the story goes after Shadowlands is just more new shit. That's it. Like, it's just going to be more. It's going to be more new shit. Whether it's the voidlords, whether it's the backside of Azeroth, whether it's more about the first ones. It's just more stuff that we've never really heard of before, except for touching on now.
I mean, the worst thing is just how much they've spoiled. Like, the backside of Azeroth, like, what, circumnavigating the globe, like when we have spaceships and, like, interdimensional travel, like, that would have been an awesome set of X-Packs, but they didn't do it. And Old Gods would have been an awesome X-Pack.
A Cataclysm
right?
2.0, where instead of it being Deathwing, it's N'Zoth. That would have been incredible.
An Old God Cataclysm would have been gangster.
Like, and it's arguably what potentially should have happened when we came back from Argus at the end of Legion. We should have come back and been like, holy fuck, while we were gone, everything's gone to shit. Now we have to fix it. Bang. New expansion. Everyone's invested. Everyone's back in. That fucking sword that's still sticking out of Azeroth. What the fuck is that doing?
Don't worry about that. It's fine. It's not a problem. Don't pay.
It's not a problem, and it will never be touched on ever again. It will
pay no
never,
attention to the giant sword.
will never be touched on. But it could have been.
There was
And
just
I think
so
that's
many
the
narrative
sour
arcs
taste.
they just wasted.
I think that's the sour taste, is that there's so many things and so many storylines that are core to Warcraft as a whole that they could have gone down before getting to this point, but instead, because they wanted to write new shit, they forsake and forgo all of that, gloss over it, and get to the new shit.
Oh, imagine
That's the really selfish thing of the writers.
And you can't go back anymore. You can't go back.
That's the biggest issue, is because of that power creep, you cannot go back, because it won't feel meaningful. Like, with everything the player characters have now faced, there are 3, as far as I can think, and I think, Declan, you said there might be another one you've thought of, but as far as I can think of, there are 3 credible threats that we are currently aware of that could be antagonists and enemies in forthcoming expansions. There's the Voidlords, who, to their credit, they've been setting up for a few expansions now. That could be potentially interesting. The Void it's now relatively well established. There's some interesting characters. There's some stuff they could do there. That would
There's
arguably
more there that we are already invested in because of Legion and BFA than anything that Shadowlands has given us.
Exactly. In terms of, I fundamentally think Shadowlands should have been a Voidlord expansion, and honestly, the way they've gone with the last 2, I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes a Voidlord expansion in the final patch. We'll see what happens with that. There's the first ones. Now, I don't think they're ready to pull the trigger on the first ones yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did, because they could be a credible threat as well. They created the Titans. We've killed Titans. We're now on to the next stage of that. And then the last one is, and we've already discussed it a little bit, faction conflict, because we know the player characters are as powerful as each other, so we could each be a credible threat to each other. I think that would be a fundamentally flawed story, because I don't think there should have been faction conflict for the last 4 expansions of WoW, but that's another issue entirely. Those are the 3 scenarios I could see them following.
Yeah, and I completely
with
agree.
any kind of integrity. To be clear, these 3 scenarios. These are the only 3 scenarios under the caveat that they continue along the logical process that they have started. They have set a precedent now for the type of progression between expansions. If they follow that progression, these are the options. If they want to completely break their own system and break their own rules and do something completely out of the blue, sure, they could do other stuff, but I think that would be an even worse option, probably.
I wouldn't be surprised, and I think the 4th option potentially is that they go something more along the lines of the light is a bit dodgier than we originally thought, considering they did set up a lot of
I think the light is another option that we haven't. The light and the Titans, again, is a point that we now know that they're not all good, that could come back to become a real threat.
Do you think they would distinguish between the light and the first ones? I feel like the light would come under the first ones category. That's my feeling on what they've done with the first ones. I could be wrong on that. I think you're right that the light has been established in a similar way to the Void. I don't think the light could carry its own expansion. I think it would fall within one of those 2 other expansions. The Void, it would be a major player. It would be our ally in the fight against the Void, and then it would turn on us in some... Like, you're correct. They have done a lot of groundwork to establish the light as, maybe it's not quite as pure as you thought. Maybe there's some potential threats there, which could be an interesting story to tell.
Yeah, I think they do still have potential to go back to things that we are more invested in, like the Light or the voidlords or things like that were built up still in a time where a lot of people were fully invested in the story of WoW. But I think the fact that they diverged from that so strongly has only taken away from that potential in the long run. To be honest, with where we've gone, the story could go fucking anywhere. Like it really could go absolutely anywhere, and it wouldn't be that much of a surprise.
Oh, because it's
That's
like
why I had to make that caveat on mine. That caveat that assuming they follow the progression they have established, and assuming it is something of which we are currently aware.
Exactly.
And both of those things I could entirely see Blizzard throwing out the window. That they do something completely that we've never heard of. You know, it's something between the first ones and the Titans that we've never heard of because we're not ready for the first ones yet. Something weird like that. Or they just, they actually do hit the reset button and everything feels meaningless at that point. We'll see.
I think the biggest issue is that they're doing stories that they want to tell, but not what WoW players want to actually consume in a way.
Yeah. I think the caveat to that is that yes, they're doing stories that they want to tell, which is like arguably more power to you. But do stories you want to tell with good storytelling, not with glossing over all the things that we should be doing to get to the story you want to tell. Like you have to make people invested in your story to tell a story. And at the point at where we are now, apart from like people who do a lot of research into the story and know exactly what's happening, not that many people were invested in what was going on. Apart from the fact that, the Lich King's helmet's broken and there's people we thought were dead back.
I think even a lot of them were just sort of going, I know what's going on, but I don't know if it's making much sense.
Yeah, and it really does come down to that. They are obviously telling the story that they want to tell, but there's a point in storytelling that you have to realize that you need to tell the story in a way that it's going to make people invested in it, not in a way that just tells the story, which I feel is currently happening. Like currently is just let's tell a story of Shadowlands. That's it, and the players will just play through it because they have to.
It almost feels like sort of fan fiction in a way, where it's just like, this is what I wanted to say, and everyone else can get stuffed.
Sylvanas and Nathanos, I will say nothing else.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's it. Like that, once again, I think the writers have been selfish with what they've done with WoW.
Mm-hmm.
Like these new set of writers, they wanted to write their story. Cool, do it, but don't ruin WoW to do it.
Yeah, and it is one of those things where, like, write your story, but recognize that there's story that has to be told before then. Like, there's so many, like, important story points that need to be addressed and need to be told to completion before you go into your story. But I think what they've done is gone, we want to tell this story. These other stories are in the way. Let's get them out of them.
And that's sort of what almost bamboozles me a bit, is that they clearly want to tell a story. Logically, you should want to get rid of as many current characters as possible, introduce your new ones. Like, they're introducing Arthas' sister, Bolvar's daughter. Like, there are characters that they're developing, but then they go to the Shadowlands to keep telling Sylvanas' story, but then they have to bring back all the characters that people care about who already had his story closed. So it feels very strange that if you wanted to properly close out the story and start doing your own thing, logically you probably shouldn't want to bring back all of these other people.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, on a point that you're talking about is like Arthas' sister coming in and things like that are all story points that people became very invested in. Like if you were playing as a priest character in Legion, and potentially through BFA as well, you came to know Arthas' sister, and that storyline is like, holy shit, what's happening here? Is she gonna do something? Is she gonna take over the Forsaken? Is there gonna become a new faction? But in the process of creating that, they sort of also do what they do with everything else and just say, hold on a minute, don't worry about that. We've got this over here. And you have to do this over here because this is what we want you to do. All that other stuff that we wrote in, which people were sort of showing a bit of interest in, that'll come back later.
I think it is also important to note in talking about the writers, which this is not me defending any of the writing decisions that have been made, because I have serious problems with basically every major writing decision. But particularly in what you were saying, Declan, we don't know how many of those decisions were writers and how many of those were other management, especially in terms of bringing back well-loved and known characters.
Yeah, 100%.
I wouldn't be surprised if those decisions were business-driven rather than story and writing-driven.
Exactly. A calculated decision to say, if we bring this person back, how many people will be more interested in.
I also think in terms of the writing change, I think it is interesting as an example from my perspective, and I know that I don't necessarily represent the majority of WoW players or lore nerds, but the Shadowlands cinematic, which it's important to remember is the first trailer cinematic or opening cinematic that was written by the new writers, at least had no hand of the previous writers. We know that the BFA cinematic had at least some input from the previous writing.
Yeah, exactly.
The Shadowlands cinematic being the first new cinematic in that regard is the first cinematic ever in WoW that failed to elicit a strong reaction from me. I wasn't even upset, I just didn't care. And I think that's really saying something. I didn't like the BFA cinematic. I was unhappy to see the faction conflict being the center of attention. Now, every other cinematic in BFA I think was fantastic. Everything with Sourfang I thought was really interesting. The opening cinematic I didn't particularly like, but it at least got a strong reaction out of me. It was very cool, and I was upset by it. The Shadowlands cinematic, I was profoundly uninterested, and I think that says something about the writing.
Yeah, and I think that was such an overarching opinion of the Shadowlands cinematic of like, everyone was watching it and going, this looks cool, like the visuals are great, but like, what the fuck is going on? Like, what the fuck is happening, and why do I need to feel something because of this?
It really just felt like the writer's Sylvanas waifu fantasy, which everyone sort of was like, okay, yeah, they want to make Sylvanas a major character, and that's pretty, like, that's all right. Everyone had just varying opinions on Sylvanas as a character.
Just to jump in, you don't have to make Sylvanas a major character. She has always been a major character since.
Yeah, exactly.
Warcraft.
Oh yeah.
I just want to put that out there.
But like, there's
have you ever needed to do that?
But like, there's Sylvanas, the major character, who, you know, was really thankful we killed the Lich King. Well, maybe not thankful, she killed herself afterwards. And then Sylvanas in this cinematic just goes, yep, I'm just gonna body the Lich King. Like, I think most people's reaction was either apathy or just, seriously? Like, that was way too easy.
Yeah, I do think as well that the cinematic team is fucking incredible. But I think the failure in that cinematic is that most WoW expansion trailers have a moment where it's supposed to have this big reaction. And I think that the moment in the Shadowlands trailer that was supposed to have that is when Sylvanas breaks the Lich King's helmet. But when that happens, at least everyone I know, and a lot of what I've seen, is that everyone was like, wait, what?
I think you've just hit on a very important point, because I agree that the breaking of the helmet was supposed to be the biggest reaction. Every reaction I saw, that was not the biggest moment. The biggest moment was right before it, when Sylvanas held the helmet in front of her and everyone thought, she's going to put it on. This is amazing.
Exactly right.
She's going to take over the Scourge.
Exactly.
And then she broke it and everyone went, aw.
Exactly right.
Wait, what's happening in the sky? What's that? Why is the sky is that Icecrown Citadel upside down? No, that's different. What's going on? I'm confused. Oh, it's over.
Well, imagine if they actually spent the expansion. Sylvanas becomes the Lich King, uses the Scourge as basically like, I'm going to declare war on life to get all the souls for the Shadowlands, and then have an entire expansion of setup for the Jailer. Like, that would have made the entire story feel so much cooler.
Give Northrend a Cataclysm makeover.
Oh yeah.
To be honest, there's a lot of things they could have done to make this better. There in fact is far fewer things they could have done to make it worse, I think.
I 100% am in agreement with that. And I think it's just, the whole thing is just this feeling of, wait, why is this happening? Or wait, why am I invested in this? And it's like, yes, we're obviously invested in it because we don't like Sylvanas. Sylvanas is killing everyone, and she's being a fucking right bitch. But apart from the fact that we hate Sylvanas, why else do we care about this? We don't.
See, I actually felt you know, having said that, I feel like I was at a disadvantage because I didn't dislike Sylvanas in BFA because she wasn't Sylvanas. I didn't care about her. I mean, that was the problem with the trailer, why I felt nothing, because Sylvanas had changed so much, and like, every interesting aspect of this character has been stripped away until she is just a cartoon villain, effectively. which is epitomized at the end of BFA. You know, yelling at all of the people you lead and screaming at them that they are all nothing. Because
it's also made even worse by the stuff that's happened in Shadowlands, and the fact that she's essentially just been blindly helping the jailer, and then out of nowhere the jailer shows his true colours, which arguably he's been showing his true colours the entire time.
Yes.
And then Sylvanas goes, "Oh no, I've been duped."
Yes, the fact that Sylvanas at no point has recognised that she has been serving the jailer is an embarrassment to everyone involved. Like, that is bottom tier lack of awareness from your character. The fact that it took the jailer to say "all will serve," and I also don't believe that he has never said that he will make other people serve him, and that it was only on that occasion that she realised that.
Goes, "Oh no!"
Her saying "I will never serve," I think was the line, something like that.
Because let's be honest, we all knew that Sylvanas was always like
she had to have a redemption arc.
There was two things that were going to happen. We were either going to kill Sylvanas, or she was going to have a redemption arc.
Both of those things will happen.
And we were never going to kill Sylvanas, not before she had a redemption arc. At least
we were going to defeat her in a boss fight.
And the redemption arc just feels so shit after the fact that it's like we're supposed to now care about this character that has shown no thought process around what she's been doing up until one single point.
Really hoping that after her, with the cutscene of her sort of, I don't know if she's kneeling or sort of cringing on the ground, you know, the jailer says, "I've given you back your mortality." I was really hoping that all of the characters around her were just going to run up and start kicking her, because that is really what she deserves. At this point, I don't know how, I mean, I know they're going to do it. I know they're going to do a redemption arc.
Oh, no question it's a redemption arc. And Sylvanas will be crucial in defeating the jailer. That doesn't make for a good story again.
The thing that is going to upset me most, and I fully believe this will happen, is when she turns her trigger word of hope around on the jailer and says, you know, she fights for hope or something like that. And it's basically Princess Leia at the end of Rogue One, you know, smiling and "you've given us hope" sort of thing. That will be deeply upsetting to me, I'm just saying.
Yeah, and again, it voids everything that has happened before. And it's just like, well, fuck, why has she done everything that she's been doing?
I mean, it'd be character growth, but at the same time, I think you have to look at the perspective of she's still committed genocide. She's still done terrible, reprehensible things. Like, there should be no redemption. There shouldn't be any character just going, "Thank God she saved the day. Isn't she great?" Which I wouldn't be surprised is the ending.
That will be something along those lines. My understanding is that part of Kaelia Manafil's arc in Shadowlands has been to come to understand that Arthas was not totally at fault and that the jailer was partly responsible for the evil things he did. So apparently Shadowlands is just where we're going to be redeeming every antagonist in Warcraft history and funneling all of their evil into the character that is the jailer. And I honestly can see a world where Blizzard ends up redeeming the jailer as well eventually, because at this point anything is possible.
Because the first one's manipulated him into doing all of these things.
It's also that other thing that's like, we go back to that comic of Sylvanas and her sisters and the Void coming to and essentially saying that like death is the only thing that can defeat us. So the Void is scared of death, and who is the death? It's the jailer. So if you're right and we're going along this line of redeeming everyone, why wouldn't we be redeeming the jailer to use him against the Voidlord?
I wouldn't be surprised if the jailer's plan turns out to be hinging on trying to destroy the Voidlords.
Well, exactly.
Because and having not played Shadowlands, I don't know every detail, but my understanding is that he is unhappy with the way the universe works and wants to reset everything. I would not be surprised to find out that he is basically Sargeras, and that the corruption of the Void is what he's trying to get rid of. And he's trying to remake the universe without the corruption of the Void.
And it also wouldn't be a massive surprise if that, in some sense, we kill him, but in the moment we kill him, it becomes evident that like, oh, the Voidlords are still a thing, they're real bad. And then it becomes evident that he was really trying to defeat the Voidlords and not necessarily trying to destroy us. We were just getting in the way. And then we're like, oh, we've accidentally killed someone who could have helped us. Oh no.
Thinking about
Sylvanas can be even more of a main character.
There must always be a jailer.
I think we'll definitely have to do a separate video on the old lore, and then we'll have to do one when the new expansion's released. Just talking about that. Although that could be a BlizzCon line episode, really.
Yeah, because I mean, I think talking about Diablo, talking about the bullshit that is Overwatch 2, and talking about whatever they announce for WoW as well is something that would be quite cool to talk about.
Oh yeah. Oh, to do a proper ending, because I realised I didn't actually do a formal one last time. Charlie, do you have any final thoughts or comments on Shadowlands?
I think what ties it up for me is that as much as I love the game mechanics of raiding and dungeons and everything that goes into it, there is a certain amount of importance in being invested in the story, and I don't think that those two things anymore are enough to keep me invested in any meaningful capacity. And I think that's quite unfortunate with where WoW has come from.
Emmett, any final thoughts?
I don't know. It's just a shame. It's just a damn shame. Everything that's happened with this game, man.
You either live long enough to become the villain or you die the hero. I think WoW has become the villain.
Well, that's it, right? I just don't think... I think Blizzard really has very little time left to actually make a change. They're not going to have the capacity to make big changes. They're already handling a PR.
And I mean, arguably they don't have the capacity anymore. They don't have any of the people who built what it was left.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing is, like, story and, like writing is not just like a given, right? You can't just like hire whoever to write the story and get a good story, evidently.
Even if people are already invested in it, exactly.
It was a passion project, right? You could just see the overarching narratives were like simple, straightforward, well done, not trying to do anything wacky or crazy. And it was just like it was a beautiful thing, right? And I just don't see that. I look at the Shadowlands cinematics and like you can't fault the Blizzard cinematic team. They absolutely like dab on the competition, right? Like gorgeous thing, but all these people I don't care about. Cool. It's like I'm watching something that isn't WoW. And with an MMO, it's like if I wanted, like I'm not here to do the mechanics. I'm here to like enjoy a story.
And lastly, Josh, any final words?
I mean, my thoughts on Shadowlands really come down to that just total lack of engagement and feeling. For me, lore and story was always one of the biggest reasons I played WoW. Sure, I liked raiding and I liked PvP, but I don't know that I ever would have got into WoW had I not been a fan of Warcraft 3, and nothing in Shadowlands felt like WoW. The tone, the setting, none of it gave me it gave me no more interest or engagement than any random MMO. Is probably the real crux of the issue. I wasn't exaggerating when I said my first reaction to the Shadowlands cinematic was almost entirely apathetic.
I think ultimately that's the biggest problem with the current narrative, is that there's not enough investment, there's not enough anything there to make people care. I think, Emmett, you're definitely right when you're sort of saying that unless they make a change very, very quickly, and I'm not convinced that they 100% can make at least enough of a change to really matter, then WoW will continue to suffer, which is a damn shame, because it is like seeing an old friend turn to drugs almost. It's a game that everyone's been playing for a very long time, and that sunk cost fallacy, even though a lot of it's gone away and broken, in a way it's sort of Stockholm syndrome-y there in a way. But with that, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.